Tailwind, the most divisive topic for web dev nerds of all time for some reason. Today we're going to cover everything you could possibly need to know about Tailwind without any of the fluff. The basics are easy. You definitely don't need a 6-hour crash course to learn that P-whatever will give you padding and M-whatever will give you margin. So I'll try to keep that stuff brief and stick with the genuinely useful stuff, starting with the obvious next question for most people: why would I ever want to use that? So Tailwind CSS is a utility-first CSS framework. You've probably heard people say that before, read it in their docs if you've ever taken a look and wondered really what that means. And it's not particularly descriptive until you actually see an example. But essentially all that it means is, as opposed to actually writing any CSS ourselves, we're just going to add a whole bunch of kind of super granular class names that apply to different styles. So for instance, something like PT6 would be like padding top of some amount. Font medium is font weight 500, something like that. And that is essentially the gist of it. There are additional utilities like dark mode utilities, stuff like that we'll go over, but at a high level, it's just that as opposed to actually writing normal CSS in a CSS file separate from our markup, we're instead going to just write our markup, more like this. To me though, the more important question is not the how, but the why would we actually do that? I want to plug one other video that I've already made before called Why People Love Tailwind CSS. That's going to go into this a little bit more detail than I probably will right now. But at a super high level, here's kind of the gist. The first thing for me is just that you get sensible presets and scaling for things like padding and text that remain consistent throughout your application. So for instance, for something like padding, if I come to their documentation for padding, you'll have, like a P1 class, which gives you 4 pixels of padding, and then a P2 class, which gives you 8 pixels of padding. This all just kind of scales up, and it's based on a system that you no longer have to think about. So every time you're writing your CSS, you don't have to go, what's the amount of padding that I normally use for something like this? Which then generally leads to little inconsistencies across your app, which are hard to kind of tell for you, but make your website look a little more amateur. The next piece is just that your styles are now actually co-located with your markup, which is counterintuitive. That's kind of what looks ugly, right? Instead of just having a container class or something, you have a whole bunch of other classes. And this seems like a small thing, but this really does lead to quite a bit of speed up, just being able to, in the same places I'm changing my actual markup, being able to say, oh, I actually want, more of a border radius here instead of less. And on top of this keeps you from having to think about any dead code. So traditionally writing CSS, you'd probably have something like, a wrapper class, which has some amount of styles in here. And then you apply that somewhere. So maybe instead of this, we just have our wrapper class here. But what actually ends up happening when somebody deletes this here and then they forget to actually go back and remove the CSS? They may get purged somewhere, but what I see happen all the time is this class never actually ends up getting removed because people are worried about removing this because maybe it's applied somewhere else that they don't know about. And they would rather, kind of leave it as opposed to risk breaking something somewhere else, which is a problem because then you end up with a whole bunch of bloat in your code base. And that needless bloat leads to my next topic, which is just that you're always going to ship the least amount of CSS that you could possibly need. Now this feels kind of weird because you have all of these individual classes and there's a million different classes inside of Tailwind. If I do something like text dash, we can just scroll and see how many different color options and things there are, but we're not actually going to ship all of these classes to the client. We're just going to ship whatever is actually needed. So the build process inside of Tailwind is going to look at your code and say, okay, these are the classes that you need. We'll ship just these classes to the client. And it removes a bunch of duplicates, right? So like if I'm using P3, so that's padding of 12 pixels or 0.75 rem, and we're using that in multiple different spots, maybe here and 10 other places on the page, we're just going to ship this one P3 class as opposed to potentially multiple different classes that are doing the exact same thing, more or less, to achieve kind of the same idea. Obviously, you can write super specific, semantic, perfect CSS all over the place and hope that your whole team does the same thing, and you'll probably get a slightly faster result. But 99.9% of the time, that's not actually what happens. You end up with more bloat. You end up with more confusing class names. By the time you have a whole bunch of different people working on your team, wrapper does not work anymore as a class name. You need wrapper, dash, whatever it is, and maybe that has some collision, and then you have to go and figure out what's going on. So you don't even need to think about that anymore. It really just helps you dummy proof your CSS, essentially. And lastly, I don't have a specific example to kind of look at for this, but it really does make things a lot easier to review in code reviews. So by example, pretend we had a whole bunch of other styles in here or something that are all linked to this same component or the same HTML file or whatever. And if I'm reviewing this code and I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, wrapper, dash, blah, blah, blah. Well, now I have to go to some other file to figure out what's actually happening with that. So maybe that class is here, and maybe that's way further down in the review that I'm reviewing, and having to actually skip back and forth in a code review to figure out what's actually being applied to something. Maybe this is being nested, maybe styles are being added in multiple different files. It gets really, really annoying. Whereas instead, I can just look at this div right here and say, okay, these are the styles that are applied to it. Looks good to me. I could go on. There's definitely other things that are super useful about Tailwind, but these are really the big ones, at least for me. If you're interested in digging in more to that, again, I have a video that I will link in the description. But let's get to actually writing some code instead of just talking about it. To get started, just cover this super quickly. If you need to install Tailwind CSS, you don't already know how this works, go and check out the Tailwind docs under tailwindcss.com/docs/installation. The way that you install Tailwind is going to be different depending on what framework you're using. If you go to the framework guide, they have docs for literally anything you could possibly need. For this example, I'm going to be using React with a Next.js app. So if you wanted to follow along with that, feel free to check out those docs, make a Next.js app, but you definitely don't need to. I'm not going to be doing anything here you can't just do in an HTML file, essentially. In fact, if you don't want to set anything up at all, you can go to play.tailwindcss.com. And this is something that's provided by Tailwind that just lets you in the browser play around with Tailwind CSS. So you can just come in here and change whatever you want. I'll just remove a bunch of stuff here. And you can just write your normal stuff here. So yeah, here, I'm just writing a bunch of stuff to make this so you can actually see something, but yeah, cool. So now we have a button, and point just being, you could write everything here if you want. You don't need to go through a whole installation process to kind of learn how this works. One more super quick thing before we actually write any code. I don't take any sponsorships or anything on this channel. I don't even sell any courses right now, but I do have a product called hover.dev. If you are a React developer and you like Tailwind, you like what you learned in this video, and especially you like things like animations, I build a whole bunch of them. I have this big component library that's full of them. We have everything from, animated hero sections to cool different navigation bars and stuff like that, all of which is animated and interactive and ready to just copy and paste directly into your projects. So yeah, if this is something that you're interested in, if you're interested in digging deeper on Tailwind or on React and animations and stuff, check it out. I even just added templates a couple of weeks ago, so like entire websites that you can use for your side projects or whatever it may be. But yeah, just wanted to get that plug out of the way before we got into the code. Let's go do that now. So finally, opening up a code editor, the first thing that we're gonna do is bootstrap a project. I already have something set up. Like I said, it's just a Next.js project. If you're just using HTML and CSS, or just in the Play CDN or whatever it may be, that it's totally fine. Just kind of ignore some of this JavaScript stuff. And before I actually write any code, I do want to recommend two little things to make your experience here a little bit easier. The first thing, if you are using VSCode, is to install the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense plugin. This is just going to give you a lot of this nice autocomplete and stuff. So if I have some class names or something, I can just hover over it and actually see what it does. And it'll tell me if different things conflict. So if I did with something like this, it's going to say, hey, these cannot both go on the same element. Second is setting up this package. It's called Prettier plugin Tailwind CSS. If you are using Prettier as your code formatter, you can just set this up and it will automatically sort your classes for you. So the reason that something like this is useful is, let's say something like this. Now, once you have a whole bunch of different classes and things on the same element, it can be confusing to actually kind of figure out a flow for them that really makes sense. For instance, I have padding on here that says P10, 40 pixels. And maybe over here I have, let's say PY of 5 or something like that. And these are disjointed from each other right now. But what this is going to do is whenever I save this, it's going to actually put them near each other. That makes it a little bit easier to figure out what's going on. I'll let you actually check out the docs for figuring out how to set that up. But essentially you just install it. Then you'll need a Prettier RC file, which has this set up as a plugin. And then it'll need to point to your Tailwind config. That's pretty much it. Now moving on to actually writing some code. I think that if you've watched this far, you've already kind of gotten the idea. I've been even known to say before, you don't need a course. I'm kind of biting my tongue by making this in the first place, to be honest with you, because all of the basic stuff in Tailwind CSS, like if you just need, colored text or you need something to be bold, most of the time you can just kind of guess what the class is, and that is how you learn Tailwind CSS. That said, I thought about it a little bit more, and there is a lot of stuff that isn't super obvious, but let's get a little basic example of just the obvious stuff out of the way so you can kind of understand the pattern of how you might start learning to write Tailwind CSS more on your own than even from this part of this tutorial. So let's just make a super basic layout. All that I have here is a div element, and I'm going to add a class. Again, I'm in React, so it's class name instead of just class, but it's the same thing. Now, let's just start thinking about what we want for this, and let's guess what the class might be. So maybe I want width to be full. I'll just type W. Well, this looks promising, right? We can see the different widths that we might want. Let's say width 12, hover over that with the plugin installed. Look at that, 48 pixels width. That is exactly what we probably would have guessed this class to be. Instead, I'm gonna go with width full, and obviously we can't see anything yet, so let's add some more classes. Maybe we want something like BG black, and this is going to give us background black, and we can't actually see anything yet, so let's give this some padding. What would you think padding would be? Well, let's just type P and let's see what we get, and kind of scroll down, and we'll start to see P dash some number. Cool, let's go P24, see what that does. There we go, cool, that looks like padding to me. Hover over this, we have padding. I'm going to clean this up a little bit with some other styles. So I'm going to change it to width full. I'm going to give it a max width, background white, looks something like this. And now let's try and give this a box shadow. Well, for box shadow, you can just kind of guess maybe something like shadow. Cool, shadow XL. They have these different scales again, which is really, really nice. So I want a big shadow for this. And there we go. Now we have our shadow. And now maybe I want to actually change the color of my shadow. Let's type shadow in again, click dash, and let's scroll down. And what we'll notice is we have other colors in here. So I want an indigo looking color. That's kind of the background color that I have here. And I'd like my shadow to kind of match that tint. So I'll scroll down. Here we go, shadow indigo. And let's go with indigo 500. There we go. Now we have a blue shadow down here under our card. Maybe that's a little bit intense though. So if I wanted to lower the opacity of this shadow, I could go dash, and then these are our different opacities. So I could do something like /15. And there we go. Now we have a lighter bluish indigo shadow. I'm going to drop in a couple of other elements in here and we can review. So now I have an H2 that has text of XL. This is just going to change the font size, font bold. I bet you can guess what that does. Font weight bold, 700. For my P tag here, I have some margin on the bottom, MB, 6, margin on the top, 3. Leading relaxed is actually our line height. So that's, a little bit of verbiage you might not have guessed immediately, but the way that you probably figure that out is just by looking up Tailwind CSS line height, and they have great documentation for everything like this. Finally, maybe I will add something like this. So now I've added a little button group down here on the bottom, and we can just read through these and understand what it's doing pretty easily. So I'm giving this a display of grid with a grid columns of 2. Again, this is all just kind of basic CSS that you should be used to if you're picking up Tailwind. Overflow of hidden, I'm giving it some rounded borders. And then I just have a couple of buttons in here with some text. Super, super simple. Hopefully all of this makes sense and you can understand that this isn't really stuff that I think you need me to read you every class name for, right? This is something that you can kind of just try and write something. And if you hit any roadblocks, if you're just like, hey, how do I change the color of a border? You can look it up in 2 seconds, figure it out, and I promise you're probably not going to forget it anytime soon. So this is the basics. I'm not going to spend any more time explaining to you different super basic class names for just adding basic CSS styles. Instead, let's move to some more advanced stuff. Next up, we're going to talk about modifiers. So getting a little bit more complicated here, still nothing too crazy, but the idea behind this is how do you handle things like hover states or focus states? And the way that you do that is with modifiers. So as a basic example, down here, we're going to go through a bunch of them here in a second. If you wanted to apply a style, just when you hover over something, all that you're going to do is prepend it with hover and then this colon right here. There's a whole bunch of these. Again, we'll go over them, but if you would like to just actually see every single one of these that's available, you can check out the documentation, just look up core concepts, handling, hover, focus, everything like this, and scroll through this doc and you can see every example. But actually going over it ourselves, let's take a look at what we've got. So for my first little example here, I just have that little button group from the last page that we were looking at. And this has a couple of different text, background colors, stuff like that. And what I want to happen here is I want to change the color of these whenever I hover over them or I click on them. So for this top button, what I could do is I have this background indigo 500. I could say whenever I hover over this, I want to change it to background indigo 600. And I've already added a transition of colors. So if you just type in transition, there's some pretty useful ones in here already for transform and shadow and opacity and stuff. But just adding it for colors like this, I can now hover over this and we should see the colors change. Now we can do the same thing down here for this other one, but maybe just when it's active. So whenever we're actually pressing on it, we want to change it to background indigo 100. So now if I come over here, hover over it and click, we'll now see that that changes the background color. Another thing you may want to be able to do occasionally is your normal CSS like first selectors or last selectors or even or odd selectors. And the way that we do that is pretty simple as well. So I have an unordered list here, just with a number of list items in it. And maybe for every first one, I want to add the text of indigo 500. I'll just add first is going to give us a normal kind of first selector. And we'll say that we want the text to be indigo 500. If I save that, now only the first one is this indigo color. Maybe I wanted to style every odd element as, with a different background color or something like that. I can totally do that as well by just saying odd and then the style like this. So this is going to give us, if we're looking at the underlying CSS, this nth child odd, which is again, pretty basic CSS. If I save that, we should now see, cool, the first and the third one have this other background color. You can even name these classes. You can, think of a case where they may collide with something else. And if you wanted to actually name them, all that you have to do is add a slash like this and then give it whatever you want that custom class to be. You're not actually going to see anything change, but if I hover over this, we will see some slightly different output CSS. One relatively cool one is group styling. So I have this element over here, and whenever I hover over it, we'll see that this element right here becomes visible. And no matter where I hover, it's actually going to become visible. So whether it's here or it's over here on the button. And another animation happens just when I hover over the button itself or click on that. And the way that we do that is with group styling. So what I've done is on my wrapping element up here, I've called this group. And what that allows me to do is add something like what you see down here. So this element is my text right here, and it has an opacity of 0 to start. But then whenever you hover over the actual group, we can kind of see what this does, right? It says, okay, the class of group, whenever that's hovered, we want to actually change the opacity. So things like this allow you to write this kind of more nested, complicated CSS that normally you would think like, okay, how would I do this with just a single class? But you actually can still achieve stuff like this just with Tailwind CSS, even if you have nested stuff. So what we're seeing down here, similar to an example I showed just a second ago, if you have nested groups, you can also name those. So instead of just group, I've called it group/follow. And then down here for this button, that's the button over here on the right, I have this little icon, and I'm saying that whenever the group is active, which is called follow, then I want to rotate it, or whenever the group is hovered, that is called follow, I want to rotate it. And that gives us something like this. One last example is using pseudo elements. So maybe I have something like an icon like this for notifications, and I want to use a pseudo element to show the little icon bubble. I can totally do that as well. It does obviously get a tiny bit bloated. I've added this on multiple lines to make this a little bit easier to see, but it's not particularly complicated. So what we're going to see is up here is my basic styling just for the element itself. And then anything that is prepended with before, like this, is the before pseudo element styles. So I'm giving it this content of 6, which gives us this right here. And then all of my other basic stylings for just positioning and grid, putting everything in the middle, the background color, text, everything like that. Super simple. It's pretty much exactly what you would guess, how you would guess this would work, at least I would think. And that is going to be it for modifiers. Let's move on to dark mode. So Tailwind CSS has native support for dark mode, also using modifiers kind of like what we saw a second ago. So in short, we see we have these two different examples, like a light mode and a dark mode version of the same element. And the way that we can do styling for this is going to look something like this. So for an element, maybe we want a background of white, and then only when the dark mode is enabled do we want to change the background to this slate 800 color. There are other ways to do this that don't require you to rewrite dark every time. I actually have a whole video on that, on a way that I like a little bit more for generally handling dark mode. So feel free to check that out if you want. But if you do want to use the native Tailwind CSS dark mode features, let's take a look at how that works. So first things first, I would like to toggle manually whether or not we're using dark mode. The other options are using system preferences, stuff like that. But the way that we can toggle this manually is inside of our Tailwind config. You should be able to find this inside of the documentation. And if you've spun everything up already, you're going to have a Tailwind config, either JS or TypeScript file, and you'll have a key that you can add to this called dark mode, which if we change to selector, we can then do something like this. So on my wrapping HTML element, if I change the class name to dark, that will automatically change this to dark mode. They have some other great documentation in here about using this if you wanted to go a route like this, so this could be useful. I'm not going to go over that right this second though. But instead, let's actually see how this works. So I have my code over here. You can see it over here on the right. Very simple. I just have this little white card with some text in it. And if we read through my different class names here, this wrapping div is the outside of the card. It has a background of white, and then in dark mode, a background of zinc 900. This text has the basic just black text. And then whenever it's dark mode, it changes to text white. This p tag right here has a text of zinc 600. And then whenever it's dark mode, text of zinc 400. Very, very simple. You could change more than just colors. You could change whatever you want if for some reason you wanted to hide an element on dark mode or whatever it may be. I've also, I'll just show this really quick, have this wrapping component right here. This is like the main component where I'm, essentially rendering this background color. And for this as well, I'm changing the background color to a darker color whenever it's on dark mode. And now all that I need to do is come to my HTML element and add the dark class, and all of this will change automatically. So yeah, super, super nice. Again, having to rewrite, every single style individually like this instead of just kind of from top down, changing all of the different colors of things can be a little bit annoying. So if this does seem like something that's a lot of extra work, feel free to check out that other video I've got. It kind of gets rid of a lot of that extra work. But anyways, let's move on to the next section. Next up, let's talk about adding responsive breakpoints. So I have a basic little nav bar thing right here, and as it gets smaller, it gets all crumpled up, and what I would like to do is make these links go away and this button go away and add a hamburger menu button. And the way that we can do that is, again, using modifiers. The modifiers that we're going to use are breakpoint modifiers. So there's a handful of these. There's SM for small, MD, LG, and XL. I think there's a handful more. There's like 5 up to 3XL, maybe something like that. 2XL? Okay, no, I lied. 2XL is the biggest one. And what we'll notice is that these breakpoints use min width. So essentially this is mobile first. So for example, let's just actually start kind of adding these. Let's say for our div right here that has all of our links in it, we actually want to hide this on smaller screens. What we're gonna do is we're gonna say hidden. This is gonna give us a display of none. And we'll see that these collide right now because you don't wanna have hidden and flex at the same time. But what we can do is say hidden and then only on medium-sized screens, which is 768 pixels, do we want to apply this display of flex. Now I'll see that these are gone. As it gets a little bit bigger, they come back and then they go away when it gets smaller. We can do this exact same thing down here for our join newsletter button. So we can say hidden, and then on medium screens, we can change it to block. Sorry about that. Yep, there we go. So hidden on smaller screens, then medium screens, we'll change it to block. And now these both should go away whenever this gets smaller. Yep, there we go. And finally, we just need to add a little hamburger button that has like the inverse styles of this. And that might look something like this. So now I just have a button down here with a menu icon inside of it. This has a display of block on smaller screens, and then on medium screens, it gets changed to hidden. So now if I go to a smaller screen, I now have a hamburger button up here on the right. And this is pretty much it. This is pretty much all that you need to know as far as handling responsiveness. Let's move on to the next section. Given that Tailwind CSS is essentially just giving us a big jumble of classes, they can add a bunch of extra cool stuff, right? Like it doesn't need to be that every single thing maps one-to-one with CSS. It's nice that it's not super bloated or anything, but they have added a handful of utility classes that are just kind of come out of the box, which are super, super useful. Unfortunately, there isn't a single page of documentation where they kind of cover these, but I'm going to cover a couple of them that I find particularly useful myself, starting with size. So all that I have here is just a div that I want to be a square like this. Normally you would have to do width and height separately, but instead you can just add size like this and it will add both of them for you. For the next example, I have this wrapping div with a number of different elements in it, and I just want to have even spacing between each of these elements. So between, my p tags and my heading here. You could use something like flex column and then add a gap, or use something like grid and then a single column and add gap. But if you don't want to have to go through that, you can also just use these space utilities like this. And essentially what these let you do is just essentially add gap between things without having to use flex or grid. So see what I mean? If I increase this, if I say space Y8, this space gets bigger. And you can also add, on the x-axis, it's not actually going to really make any change here. You'll see that this isn't perfect though, because, if I'm adding space X to something, it's essentially just adding margin to different elements like this. So this is just going to take everything besides the first element and add a margin left to it. But for some instances, it can be really, really useful where you would rather not use flex or grid. For this next example, I have a basic little navigation bar thing, and I have a couple of little icons here like these, but these are not particularly semantic. Obviously, you can use things like aria label, but just as an example, I am using these little spans like these, and I am allowing these to label our elements. And the way that I'm doing that is, these are hidden, but they're not using a display none or something, which might hide them from a screen reader. You'll notice that they're not actually visible over here next to my icons, and the way that I'm doing that is using this SR only class. So SR only essentially just adds a whole bunch of different classes, which in effect removes this element from the screen from being actually visible, but it's not going to remove it from the page. So if you're using a screen reader or something, it's going to find this button. It's going to see that it's labeled settings based on the span, and it can actually read that out. Of course, this can be applied, based on different screens. If you wanted this to also be, visible on smaller screens or something like that, you say SR only for smaller, and then you could go back to not SR only for bigger screens. So as this gets bigger, there we go. Now it's going to pop back. Obviously that looks a little bit stupid, but I think you get the idea. Divide is another pretty cool one. So I have these 3 buttons right here in this group. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to add little borders between each of them. I could, of course, come in and for each of these say, okay, this one needs a border right and this one needs a border right. But then every time I add a new button, I have to remember to also add a border. Kind of annoying. But what you can do instead is use this divide utility like this right here. I have this divide zinc 300, and that will essentially add that border for you to all elements besides, the last one. So yeah, little time saver, pretty niche, but I have found this to be pretty useful. The ring utility essentially allows you to add an additional border outside of your elements using box shadows. So this is obviously pretty specific, but as an example, if we zoom in right here, we'll see that I have this little kind of faint border outside of my input here. And then whenever I focus on this element, it changes colors and it zooms in, makes it look like the actual border is larger. This is nice because this faux border doesn't actually take up any space in the DOM since it's just a shadow, and it can be used to kind of stack and make cool effects, kind of like what we see right here. And finally, animations. There's a number of these that come out of the box with Tailwind. So if you just type in animate, you can see there's spin, ping, pulse, and bounce. You can definitely play around with those. I also have a recent video where I go over how to add your own to Tailwind CSS, which is super useful, and some plugins that do that for you. But for this one, I just have this little notification icon down here that has this little span, which has the animate ping on it. And you can see that over here on the right. Now, Tailwind comes with pretty much everything out of the box you could need to make the majority of websites, but sometimes you do want to use, or most of the time, I guess, you probably at least want to use one of your own brand colors, maybe a whole bunch of different brand colors, different, gray palettes, stuff like that. And you can totally do that. You can even override things like these default sizes for text and padding and things if you think you can do a better job. And the way that we do that, we can actually take a look at the documentation for this really quick, is using the config file. So any project is going to have a Tailwind config JS file, and inside of that, you can add different stuff to your theme. So if you want to completely override stuff, so like if you only want to allow these colors, you can just go theme, and then just directly add them like that. But if you also want to extend them, you can go to extend and then drop stuff in here like that. Let's actually take a look at my example really quick. Might be a little bit easier to see. So what I've done in my config file right here is I've said under theme, I've then added extend because I don't want to get rid of all the other colors. I just want to add my own new colors to the base set. And I've added a brand color, which is this kind of reddish color, and a couple of kind of base colors that are grayish colors. Now, if we look at my theming example over here, we'll see that I've changed my shadow color to base, and this is all giving me the same IntelliSense and everything. This is that little hex code that I just added over here. So this is base 200 with this E6E1E1. Look back over here, same color. And I've also even changed my button colors down here to use this brand color. These will be just named the way that you name them in your config file. So border brand, background brand, text brand, everything like that. You don't need to define each of these classes individually. It will pick this up as a color and make these available to you. One thing that's also useful that I haven't really brought up yet is that you can do arbitrary values for any individual thing that you need to do an arbitrary value for. By arbitrary value, I mean, let's say for this background right here, I don't want to actually add a new color to my theme. I just need it for this one spot. If I need to do that, all that I need to do is I'll remove this and I'll open up square brackets, and then I can just add my color here. So maybe we needed RGBA, and I'll just pick some random color, maybe 155. You can't do spaces, obviously, because this is a string. So instead of spaces, you just do underscores like this, and I'll just pick some random color, just see what that looks like. Okay, cool. Now we have this darker red color. If you wanted, you could totally drop this in your config file and reuse it. But for this example, I'm just using an arbitrary value like this. And again, you can do this for all kinds of stuff. So maybe for this border, I'm doing 12 pixels. Maybe just for this one specific border, for whatever reason, I want 24 pixels. And there we go. Now we have a sharper border. One thing that I would definitely recommend not doing, let me kind of go back here, is inside of your config, overriding things like sizing. So like text size or padding size or stuff like that. Or really unless you know what you're doing. Obviously, if you're a designer and you have your own kind of font scaling formula, totally feel free to do that. But if you're a developer like me and you don't really have the eye for understanding the different sizing scales and things like that, I would leave it to the default. I very rarely run into a situation where I need anything that falls outside of that default sizing set for margin or padding or text size or anything. But anything like colors, or if you want to add your own animations or anything, those are definitely things that I generally add into my theme, and so that I can reuse them throughout my project. So next up, we have functions and directives. I generally try to avoid these kind of as much as I can. I like to just use normal Tailwind CSS, but if you ever needed to extend the actual kind of base classes, you can totally do that using these functions and directives. There's a whole bunch of different stuff in here that I'm probably not going to cover right now, but just as a basic example, let's say for H1s, you can kind of give some base styling to your different elements, and you can do these anywhere that you're importing these directives from Tailwind CSS. So we're saying we have this layer base that comes in from here, and we're applying Tailwind styles using this @apply directive directly in our CSS file. Or for instance, maybe we want to create our own little component system, similar to something like Bootstrap. We can totally do that using our own Tailwind CSS classes. Let's take a look at my example really quick. So I have this little button right here. And if we look at the code for this, All that this has is a button with a single class name of btn. So this looks more like normal CSS because it is. If we go over to our actual global CSS file, I've imported our directives up here. And then for my layer for components, I'm adding a new component that I'm calling button, and I'm adding a bunch of different Tailwind CSS classes to it. This way I can just reuse this btn class wherever I want, as opposed to having to componentize it or whatever to reuse this. Again, I generally try to avoid this myself because it can lead to some of the same issues. You're kind of back to just writing CSS, but if it is something that you have a use for, definitely know that you can do stuff like this. You can override defaults, you can make your own classes that use Tailwind CSS classes and then reuse those using, normal CSS classes like this. Anyways, let's move on to plugins. So plugins are where the community or even yourself come in to take the base functionality of Tailwind and extend it in ways that aren't initially supported just by Tailwind CSS itself. So there's a number of these that are supported out of the box and are maintained by the Tailwind team. We'll take a look in a second at how you can kind of make these or how you can add them to your files. But some examples are, for instance, a typography plugin, this forms plugin, container queries. You can add support for those. And let's just take a look at this first example, and then we'll come and look at some other plugins that you could look at. So what I have over here in my code, in my Tailwind config, I've installed a package called Tailwind CSS Typography. And then inside of my config, under plugins, you can just open up an array and pass in a require statement for whatever the plugin is. And what this will do is it will add additional utility classes to your Tailwind. So over in my file over here, what we're going to see is using this typography plugin, I can add a class called prose. And this is just going to give me styles for all of my kind of basic, think of it like CMS content, right? So this is really useful if you have like a blog and you don't want to have to maintain the styling for all of your different kind of individual items, right? So like I have a heading and then I have a paragraph and I have a block quote, and none of these have any styles on them. But if we look at the output, it has a bunch of styles, right? Like the heading is big. It's essentially like a reset, I guess you could think, without having to actually write all of these styles yourself. These are flexible. You can do all kinds of stuff with them. I don't want to go into all the specifics of this one plugin, but if you want to, feel free. If you want to use dark mode for it, you can do prose invert like this and change whatever the colors are. But for now, let's go and actually look at some other plugins. So probably the most famous Tailwind plugin is Daisy UI. And Daisy UI is an entire library, essentially like Bootstrap, that's built on top of Tailwind CSS. So if we take a look at that, we can come in here and look at, say alert, something like that. Maybe a better example actually would be something like button. And we can look that they have all of these different buttons and you can change the themes. Like maybe we want this dark mode theme. If I look at the JSX, what we'll notice is it looks a lot more like Bootstrap. It looks a lot more like those classes I was talking about a minute ago. So you can just add something like BTN and then give it a color and it will add all of the Tailwind classes for you. Now, for a lot of people, this is super useful. If you just want a basic style out of the box that everybody can follow, you can totally use something like this, but that's not necessarily the only use case for plugins. Another example would be something like Tailwind CSS Animate, which gives us a bunch of different utilities for making our own animations directly in our Tailwind CSS. So by default, Tailwind doesn't give some of these classes, for instance, for like delay and duration and things for animations specifically. It won't let you set fill modes. It won't let you set things like your play mode, whether or not the animation is running or it's paused. And this plugin just gives you access to all of those classes, which is super, super nice. There's a whole bunch of these. You can even make your own. I will let you guys check out the documentation on that. It's something I've been thinking about making a video on for a while, so maybe I'll do that sooner than later, but probably out of the scope for this video specifically. If that is something you're interested in, definitely hit a like and subscribe. I'm sure I'll make that video sooner than later. But anyways, we have more stuff to talk about. Let's move to the next section. And last but not least, I guess this is kind of a bonus tip because this isn't necessarily talking about a Tailwind feature, but I just want to talk a second about the most useful tooling that I found for Tailwind CSS. Generally, Tailwind CSS is used in tandem with something like React or another component-based framework. And with that, there are a couple of issues that we generally run into. The first of those is coalescing different classes. So I just wanted to call it this Tailwind merge package. And the issue, we can kind of look at an example right here. So if I bump this up for you a little bit. The base styles for a component might have a padding on the x-axis of 2 and a padding on the y-axis of 1, but we built a component on top of this that takes in a class name that wants to be able to override that class. Well, you can run into conflicts here, right? Because maybe somebody passes in some classes that, conflict with the ones that are already in your base string, and that can cause issues. Like here, we have background red, and then we're passing in some other arbitrary value. we might not actually pick up the background that we're trying to override. What Tailwind merge will do is it will take all of your base classes, and then if anything is going to override it, it will make sure that that actually overrides it. As an example, we can look at what I've got right here. So down here, I have this component. You can see it over here on the right, and this has a width of fit, rounded full, has some base background color and padding and things. And then it's taking in a prop called class name, which it's passing into this Tailwind merge function that then gets passed into the class name of the div right here. If I scroll up to how I'm actually using this, I'm passing in a class name of background indigo 500. If I remove that, we should see this go back to this black color. And essentially, this wasn't actually going to work without Tailwind merge, right? Because I'm trying to pass in a background color. And if I was just adding these strings together, how would it know whether or not it should use the class name, the background that I'm passing in, or this background that's already in the string? At that point, you're just kind of leaving it up to the cascade, which is not ideal. Using a tool like TW merge guarantees that you actually use the class that you intend to use. Last but not least is probably my favorite package when working with Tailwind as far as building out component libraries and things. Let me show you guys an example. So normally you're gonna, not rewrite things like your buttons or inputs every single time. You're gonna build them once, you're gonna build a component on top of them, and then you or whoever's on your team is going to reuse that component. And there's this package called CVA, or Class Variance Authority, that makes that super, super easy. You can check out the docs if you want, but as a basic example, we'll just scroll down here. Essentially how this works is something like this. So you'll import this CVA function, and the first property that you're going to pass into CVA is whatever your default styles are that should be applied to every variation of this button. So I want all of them to have a rounded border and a font weight of medium. Then we'll have this variance right here, like this variance key, which gets passed into an object as the second parameter. And each of these keys in here are the different props that we want to be able to pass into our component. So for instance, size, maybe we want size with two options, one for small, one for large, and they apply these sets of classes. Maybe we want one like intent, which is like your color. So like a primary button should have these styles, or a secondary button should have these styles. You can add what's called compound variants. So essentially here we're saying, okay, if the intent is primary and the size is medium, then we should add a class of uppercase. And you can then also add your default variants. So by default, I want this button to be primary with a size of medium. If you're using TypeScript, this has some super useful options on top of that with this variant props. So you can pretty easily define whatever your props should be, and then define your component like this, just passing in all of the props. And this will give you essentially a button, like a reusable component button that you can use like a normal button anywhere else. And we'll see that I'm already passing in some of these classes here, or some of these props here. So if I hover over this, we'll see that my intent is primary or secondary. Right now it's primary. I can change this to secondary, and we'll see that it has really nice type safety where this isn't, the actual string that is able to be passed in. It's going to give us this red line right here. So secondary, save that. And now we have our secondary button. You could then make it small, and you can just, extend this, do this with whatever you want, do it with your cards, with your buttons, with your checkboxes, whatever, and use this tool to build a really useful, really easy to use design system for your own projects on top of Tailwind CSS. Technically, this doesn't have to be on top of Tailwind CSS. If you wanted to do this with normal CSS or modules or whatever, you can use the same package, but for me personally, I find it really useful, specifically in tandem with Tailwind. But anyways, I think it's going to be it for this one, guys. If you got anything out of this, I would massively appreciate a like and a subscribe. If you wanted to check out my website, I would obviously appreciate that as well. Leave a comment on what was useful about this, if there's anything else that I should have added. Maybe I'll make another video with follow-ups if anybody has any. Beyond that, I will see you guys next time. Peace.